"Where is this man?" Claire Whitmore asked, and for the first time that morning, 12 executives around the 48th floor conference table stopped talking. Moments earlier, Whitmore Systems had been moving at its usual relentless pace. Phones vibrated against polished walnut. Coffee cooled beside tablets filled with projections. Beyond the glass walls, downtown Chicago stretched beneath a pale morning sky, while Claire prepared to approve documents tied to one of the most important negotiations of the year. Then a thin stack of papers appeared where it did not belong. "What's this?" she asked. Her assistant glanced over. "Hiring forms. HR must have mixed them into your packet." Claire almost pushed them aside. "Custodian. Maintenance technician. Night cleaner. Ordinary applications for ordinary jobs, at least by the standards of people who measured importance by salary and floor number." She turned one page, then another. Her fingers stopped. Ethan Cole, applicant for janitorial services. 39 years old. The resume was painfully simple, almost too simple. Several short-term jobs. A long unexplained gap. No impressive title beneath his name. No executive references. Nothing that should have held the attention of a billionaire CEO for more than 5 seconds. Yet Claire did not turn the page. Near the bottom was a handwritten response from a routine screening exercise. Applicants had been shown a simple maintenance scenario and asked what they would check first. Most had written the obvious answers: equipment, wiring, power supply. Ethan had crossed out his first response and written something smaller beneath it. Claire leaned closer. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Somewhere beyond the conference room, an elevator chimed. Richard Hale, Whitmore's chief operating officer, tapped his pen against the table. Claire. She didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on Ethan Cole's handwriting. Something about the wording bothered her, not because it was wrong, but because it felt strangely deliberate. Familiar, almost. "We're already 8 minutes behind," Richard said. "The investors will be here before noon." Claire finally looked up. "Who processed this application?" Her assistant blinked. "I can find out." "Do it." Richard gave a quiet laugh. "We're stopping a multi-billion-dollar strategy meeting over a janitor." Claire closed the folder. "I didn't say we were stopping anything." "Then what exactly are we doing?" She turned toward the glass wall, where 48 floors below them people crossed the marble lobby like pieces on a chessboard. Somewhere down there sat a man who had arrived asking for permission to clean offices after everyone else went home. A man nobody upstairs had expected to notice. Claire picked up the application again. "Where is he?" Her assistant checked her tablet. "Ethan Cole. He's still downstairs. His interview hasn't started yet." "For custodial work?" Richard asked, emphasizing the words as though the job itself settled the man's worth. "Yes." Claire's expression remained unreadable. "Should I tell HR to send the file back?" her assistant asked. Claire looked once more at Ethan's name, then at the small handwritten sentence beneath it. The room waited. 12 executives. 12 expensive titles. Not one understood why their CEO had suddenly forgotten the meeting in front of her. Claire lowered her voice until everyone had to become quiet to hear it. "No." Her assistant hesitated. "Then what should I tell them?" Claire placed Ethan Cole's application carefully on top of the billion-dollar contract. "Bring him to me." 90 minutes earlier, Ethan Cole had stepped through the revolving doors of Whitmore Systems carrying everything he needed in one worn brown folder. No expensive resume case. No tailored suit. No recommendation from anyone with a corner office. Just a clean white shirt, a navy tie he had owned for nearly 10 years, and a folded drawing his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, had slipped into his coat pocket before school. "Good luck, Dad," she had written across the top in purple crayon, beneath 2 stick figures holding hands beside a crooked yellow sun. Ethan had smiled when he found it on the train. Now, standing beneath the 40-foot glass ceiling of the Whitmore lobby, he touched the folded paper through his pocket and quietly reminded himself why he was there. Around him, polished shoes crossed marble floors. Employees tapped security badges against silver gates. Elevators chimed every few seconds while enormous digital screens displayed projects worth more money than Ethan expected to see in a lifetime. He did not envy any of it. He needed steady hours, health benefits, and a schedule that would let him pick Sophie up from after-school care before 6. That was enough. Janitorial applicants check in at the desk on the left. A receptionist said without looking up. "Thank you." Ethan joined 6 other applicants beside a row of gray chairs. One man glanced at Ethan's carefully repaired shoes, then at his own new work boots. Big place for pushing a mop, he joked. Ethan gave him a small smile. Floor is still a floor. The man chuckled, but Ethan had already opened his folder. His application carried an uncomfortable amount of empty space. Years that could not be explained neatly in a box. Jobs taken because they fit Sophie's school schedule. Maintenance work. Warehouse shifts. Building services. Nothing glamorous. Nothing he was ashamed of. A recruiter named Megan Foster called him into a small interview room and slid a screening form across the table. Basic problem solving, she said. Nothing complicated. Ethan nodded. The first questions concerned cleaning chemicals, safety procedures, and equipment storage. Then came a maintenance scenario involving a floor cleaning machine that repeatedly lost power near one section of a building. 3 possible causes were listed beneath it. Ethan read them twice. His pencil stopped. Something wrong? Megan asked. Maybe. He studied the diagram printed beside the question. The machine was not the interesting part. The pattern was. Ethan crossed out the answer he had started and wrote a short note beneath it. Megan raised an eyebrow. That was not one of the choices. I know. Then why write it? Ethan set down the pencil. Because the choices assume the machine is the problem. Megan looked at the page, then back at him. And you do not. A system rarely fails where everyone is looking. For the first time, she studied him instead of his resume. Ethan simply folded his hands. He had not come to impress anyone. He had come to work. 5 minutes later, Megan stepped outside to copy his paperwork. Ethan remained alone beneath the quiet fluorescent lights, unaware that his screening form would be placed in the wrong stack, carried into an elevator, and sent 48 floors above the job he had come to ask for. Where is this man? Claire Whitmore asked, and 12 executives around the conference table suddenly forgot about the billion-dollar documents in front of them. Until that moment, the 48th floor of Whitmore Systems had moved with the polished certainty of a place where hesitation cost money. Tablets glowed beside untouched coffee. Phones vibrated against walnut. Beyond the glass walls, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath a pale morning sky, while Claire reviewed the final preparations for one of the largest negotiations her company had faced that year. Then she opened a folder that was never supposed to reach her desk. What is this? Her assistant glanced over. Hiring paperwork. Human resources must have mixed it into your packet. Claire nearly pushed it aside. Custodian. Maintenance worker. Night cleaner. One application after another. Ordinary names attached to jobs nobody in this room would discuss during an executive meeting. Then her hand stopped. Ethan Cole. Janitorial services applicant. 39 years old. His resume was strangely plain. Short-term maintenance jobs. Warehouse work. Building services. A long, unexplained gap that would make most recruiters hesitate. No executive references. No prestigious title. Nothing that should have held Claire Whitmore's attention for more than a few seconds. Yet she kept reading. Claire, Richard Hale said from across the table, the investor briefing starts in 20 minutes. She did not answer. Near the bottom of Ethan's screening form was a handwritten response to a routine maintenance problem. The printed question offered several obvious explanations for a malfunctioning cleaning machine. Ethan had started to select one, crossed it out, then written a sentence beneath the choices instead. Claire leaned closer. The fluorescent lights hummed. Overhead, an elevator chimed somewhere beyond the conference room. Even the soft tapping of Richard's pen began to sound unusually loud. Who processed this application? Claire asked. Her assistant blinked. I can check. Please do. Richard leaned back. We are interrupting a strategy meeting over a janitor. Claire finally looked at him. Her expression remained calm. No, you are interrupting me while I am reading. The room went still. Claire returned to the page. There was something about Ethan's wording. Something precise. Something familiar enough to trouble a memory she could not quite reach. She turned the application over, searching for another page. There was none. That is his entire file? She asked. It appears so. Where is he now? Her assistant opened the hiring system on her tablet. A few seconds passed. Ethan Cole is downstairs. He checked in this morning. For custodial work? Richard asked, almost amused. Yes. Claire rose and walked toward the glass wall. 48 floors below, people crossed the marble lobby in every direction, each carrying a badge, a title, a destination. Somewhere among them was a single father asking for permission to clean the building after those people went home. Claire looked again at the name on the application. Should I send his paperwork back to Human Resources? Her assistant asked. Claire closed the folder carefully and placed it directly on top of the contract worth billions. No. Her assistant waited. What should I tell them? Claire lowered her voice, and every person at the table became quiet enough to hear 4 words. Bring him to me. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Ethan Cole immediately knew this was not where janitorial interviews were supposed to happen. The carpet was thick enough to silence his footsteps. Glass walls framed offices larger than his apartment living room, and the Chicago skyline stretched beyond them in silver and blue. Megan Foster walked beside him, holding his folder against her chest. She seemed almost as confused as he was. I was told the chief executive officer requested you personally, she said. Ethan glanced at her. Does she usually interview custodial applicants? Never. Good to know. Megan almost smiled. At the end of the corridor, Claire Whitmore stood beside a conference room door. Richard Hale remained inside with several executives, his expression making it clear that Ethan's presence had already become an inconvenience. Claire extended her hand. Mr. Cole. Ms. Whitmore. His handshake was steady, brief, respectful. No nervous laugh. No attempt to impress her. Claire noticed. Richard noticed too, though for a different reason. This is the applicant, he asked. Yes, Claire said. Richard looked at Ethan's inexpensive tie, worn shoes, then the folder in Megan's hands. For janitorial services. I am aware. Ethan remained quiet. He had learned long ago that dignity did not require answering every insult disguised as an observation. Claire gestured toward the conference table. Please sit. Ethan did. Claire placed his screening form before him. You wrote this? Yes. Why? Because the listed answers did not fit the pattern. Richard sighed. It was a cleaning equipment question. Ethan turned toward him. Then the machine should fail everywhere. Silence. Claire leaned forward. Explain. Ethan pointed to the diagram. The problem only happens in one section of the building. Same machine. Same operator. Same procedure. If the equipment were failing, location would not matter. Claire watched his eyes. He was not guessing. So what would you check? The power feeding that section. And if the power tests normally? Load variation. And if that is normal? Ethan paused. Then I would stop assuming the problem begins where the symptom appears. Richard gave a small, impatient laugh. That sounds philosophical for a janitor. Ethan met his gaze without hostility. Troubleshooting usually sounds obvious after someone finds the problem. No one laughed with Richard. Claire reached for a tablet and turned it toward Ethan. On the screen was a simplified systems diagram from an internal training presentation. What do you see? Ethan studied it for several seconds. Is this part of my interview? Consider it curiosity. His eyes moved across the diagram once more. Nothing is wrong with it. Richard leaned back as if the exercise had ended exactly as expected. Claire did not move. Nothing, she asked. Ethan shook his head. The diagram is correct. He tapped one corner of the screen. The assumption behind it is not. Claire's expression changed almost imperceptibly. What assumption? Ethan looked at her now, calm and direct. That these 3 systems are independent. The room became quieter. One executive stopped typing. Richard's smile disappeared. Claire folded her hands. How did you know that? Ethan glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at her. Ms. Whitmore, I came here because I need steady work. I can clean floors, follow procedures, and show up on time. Claire studied him. That does not answer my question. No, ma'am. Then answer it. Ethan was silent for a moment. Are you interviewing me for the job I applied for? For the first time that morning, Claire Whitmore had no immediate reply. 90 minutes earlier, Ethan Cole had stepped through the revolving doors of Whitmore Systems with a worn brown folder in one hand and a quiet promise in his heart. He had not come looking for prestige. He had come looking for a paycheck, health benefits, and a schedule that would let him be waiting when his 8-year-old daughter walked out of after-school care. That morning, Sophie had stood beside their tiny kitchen table while Ethan straightened the navy tie he had owned for nearly 10 years. You look nervous, Dad. Ethan smiled at her reflection in the microwave door. Do I? A little. Then I better fool everybody. Sophie giggled and handed him his coffee. Before he left, she slipped something into his coat pocket without explanation. Ethan discovered it later on the train into downtown Chicago. It was a folded drawing in purple crayon. Two stick figures holding hands beneath a crooked yellow sun. Across the top, she had written, "Good luck, Dad." Ethan folded it carefully and placed it over his heart. Now, beneath the 40-foot glass ceiling of Whitmore Systems, that little drawing mattered more to him than every polished surface around him. Employees moved through the lobby with security badges, expensive briefcases, and practiced urgency. Elevators chimed. Shoes clicked against marble. A faint scent of coffee mixed with fresh floor wax. Ethan approached the reception desk. "Janitorial applicant," he said. The receptionist pointed left without looking up. "Check in with Human Resources." "Thank you." 6 applicants waited in gray chairs outside a small interview suite. One man glanced at Ethan's repaired shoes and smiled. "Pretty fancy building for pushing a mop." Ethan sat down beside him. "Floor is still a floor." The man laughed. Ethan did not. He simply opened his folder and reviewed his application. The empty years on his resume looked larger under fluorescent light. Maintenance work, warehouse shifts, building services, jobs chosen for hours, not titles, jobs that let him make dinner, attend school meetings, and be there when Sophie woke from a bad dream. Ethan Cole. A recruiter named Megan Foster appeared at the doorway. Ethan followed her into a small room. She placed a screening form on the table. Mostly routine questions. Safety procedures, equipment, basic problem solving. Understood. Ethan worked quietly until he reached a diagram showing a floor cleaning machine that repeatedly lost power in one section of a building. 3 possible causes were listed. He studied the page. His pencil stopped. Megan noticed. Problem. Maybe. The question is supposed to be straightforward. That is what bothers me. Ethan selected an answer, paused, then crossed it out. Beneath the printed choices, he wrote a sentence instead. Megan leaned closer. That is not one of the options. I know. Why change your answer? Ethan tapped the diagram. Because every option assumes the machine is failing, and you think it is not. If the same machine works everywhere except one location, I would check the location before replacing the machine. Megan studied him. That sounds like more than basic maintenance. Ethan set down the pencil. It is just paying attention. He added one final sentence beneath his answer. A system rarely fails where everyone is looking. Megan stared at the words for a moment, then gathered the paperwork. I will make a copy. Ethan nodded. Take your time. She stepped into the hallway. Ethan remained beneath the soft fluorescent hum, one hand resting near Sophie's drawing inside his coat, unaware that his application was about to be placed in the wrong stack, carried into an elevator, and delivered 48 floors above the job he had come to ask for. Claire held Ethan's gaze for a long moment, then slowly closed the tablet. Fair question, she said. Richard shifted in his chair, clearly ready to end what he considered an unnecessary interruption, but Claire was no longer interested in his impatience. Megan, would you give us a few minutes? Megan nodded and left the conference room. Claire turned back to Ethan. You applied for janitorial services. If that is the job you want, I will respect that. But your resume leaves questions. Ethan's expression remained calm. Most resumes do. Not like yours. Claire opened his file. 12 years ago, there is almost nothing. Then maintenance work, warehouse shifts, building services. No clear career path. There was a path. What happened to it? Ethan glanced toward the windows. Chicago stretched beneath them, bright and distant, but his thoughts had moved somewhere smaller, somewhere warmer. A kitchen with secondhand chairs. A little girl standing on a stool because she was too short to reach the sink. Life changed, he said. Claire waited. Ethan understood that silence could be a question too. My wife was Rachel, he finally said. She passed away when Sophie was 3. The room seemed to lose some of its corporate coldness. Even Richard stopped tapping his pen. Ethan did not ask for sympathy. He simply continued. At the time, I had work that required travel. Long weeks. Late nights. I kept telling myself I was building a future for my family. His voice stayed steady. Then suddenly the future was a 3-year-old girl asking why her mother was not coming home. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment. I am sorry. Thank you. No performance. No bitterness. Just 2 words offered with quiet grace. Claire looked again at the gaps in his resume. They no longer seemed empty. So you left your career? I left a schedule that made me a visitor in my daughter's life. Richard folded his arms. And you never went back? Ethan looked at him. Sophie needed breakfast more than I needed a title. The answer landed softly, but nobody rushed to speak after it. Ethan remembered those first years with painful clarity. Learning how to braid hair from online tutorials before school. Packing lunches at 6 in the morning. Taking evening maintenance shifts so he could attend parent conferences. Sitting at a laundromat with Sophie asleep against his shoulder while dryers turned beneath fluorescent lights. There had been bills he could barely cover and opportunities he had quietly declined. Yet there had also been spelling tests taped to the refrigerator, Saturday pancakes, and a child who never had to wonder whether her father would show up. Claire studied the man across from her differently now. "Why janitorial work?" she asked. Ethan answered without hesitation. "The hours are predictable. The benefits are good. The commute is 35 minutes if the train behaves. Sophie's after-school program closes at 6. Claire almost smiled. "You researched us." "I research anything that affects my daughter." Richard glanced at the technical diagram again. "That still does not explain how you saw what our own people might miss." Ethan's eyes moved to the screen, then back to Richard. "You asked about my life." I answered. "And your past?" Claire asked gently. Ethan stood and straightened his old navy tie. "Some parts of a man's past explain where he has been. They do not decide who he has to be." He picked up his brown folder. Claire watched him move toward the door, and one thought refused to leave her. Ethan Cole had not walked away from ambition because he lacked ability. He had walked away because something mattered more. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, and Ethan Cole knew immediately that janitorial interviews did not happen on floors like this. The carpet softened every footstep. Glass walls reflected the pale Chicago morning, and offices lined the corridor with views that seemed to stretch all the way to Lake Michigan. Megan Foster walked beside him carrying his brown folder, though her expression suggested she understood the situation no better than he did. "The chief executive officer asked to see you personally," she said. Ethan glanced at her. "Does she usually interview custodial applicants?" "Not once since I have worked here." "Then we are both having an unusual morning." At the end of the hallway, Claire Whitmore waited outside the conference room. Richard Hale stood several feet behind her, arms folded, his impatience visible before anyone spoke. Claire extended her hand. "Mr. Cole." "Ms. Whitmore." Ethan shook it once, steady and respectful. Richard looked him over, from the old navy tie to the carefully repaired shoes. "This is him." "Yes," Claire said. "The janitorial applicant." "I know what position he applied for, Richard." Ethan said nothing. He had spent enough years working around people with expensive titles to understand that not every slight deserved an answer. Claire gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." Ethan sat. She placed his screening form on the table. "You wrote this sentence?" "Yes." "A system rarely fails where everyone is looking." "That is what I wrote." "Why?" Ethan pointed toward the maintenance diagram. "Because the question assumes the cleaning machine is the problem." Richard exhaled impatiently. "It is a cleaning machine problem." Ethan turned toward him. "Then it should fail everywhere." Silence followed. Claire leaned closer. "Explain." "Same machine. Same operator. Same procedure. But the failure happens in one location. That makes location the variable. What would you check first? Power supply. If that tested normally, load changes. And after that, Ethan paused. I would stop looking at the symptom and find what the symptom shares with the rest of the system. Claire watched him carefully. 3 questions. 3 answers. No hesitation, no performance, no attempt to sound clever. Richard gave a small laugh. That is a lot of theory for someone applying to clean floors. Ethan met his eyes. A clean floor still requires knowing why it keeps getting dirty. Nobody laughed with Richard. Claire reached for a tablet and turned it toward Ethan. A simplified internal systems diagram filled the screen. "Then, tell me what you see here." Ethan studied it. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Nothing wrong. Richard leaned back, satisfied. Claire remained still. "Nothing. The diagram is correct." Ethan touched one corner of the screen. "The assumption is not." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Which assumption?" "That these 3 systems are independent." One executive stopped typing. Another slowly lowered his coffee cup. Richard's expression tightened. Claire asked, "How did you know that?" Ethan looked from the tablet to her. "Pattern." "What kind of pattern?" "The kind that only looks complicated when everyone studies the pieces separately." Claire sat back. There it was again, that strange precision beneath an ordinary answer. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Ethan glanced at the wall clock. He had promised Sophie he would pick her up before 6. He had come for honest work, not an examination of a life he had deliberately left behind. Ms. Whitmore, I can follow procedures. I can work nights when necessary. I can maintain equipment, and I will show up when I say I will. Claire did not look away. That was not my question. No, ma'am. Then answer the one I asked. Ethan folded his hands on the table. His voice remained calm, but something in the room shifted when he spoke. Are you interviewing me for the job I applied for? For the first time since he entered the 48th floor, nobody seemed to remember that Ethan Cole was supposed to be the least important person in the room. 3 weeks later, Ethan Cole was exactly where he had asked to be. Not in an executive office. Not behind a glass conference table. He was on the 37th floor at 6:45 in the evening, pushing a blue janitorial cart beneath the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Claire had approved his hiring without changing the position, and Ethan had respected her for that. He had asked for honest work, and she had given him honest work. His gray uniform carried a simple badge with his name and building services beneath it. Most employees barely noticed him. Ethan preferred it that way. Evening, Mr. Cole, a young engineer said while hurrying toward the elevators. Evening. Long. Night. Not if everyone goes home on time. The engineer smiled and disappeared behind closing doors. Ethan returned to polishing the glass outside a systems conference room. Inside, 6 engineers stood around a digital display filled with diagrams and performance reports. Their voices carried through the partially open door. The latency spike is coming from the application layer. Then why does it disappear during regional isolation? Because the monitoring data is delayed. That does not explain the synchronization drift. Ethan's cloth stopped against the glass. 1 second. 2. Then it moved again. He had spent 3 weeks learning the building by cleaning it. Which departments stayed late? Which elevators stalled between floors? Which executives thanked the night staff and which walked past without seeing them? He had also learned something else. Whitmore Systems was preparing for something enormous. Teams worked past dinner. Conference rooms stayed lit until midnight. Security around the primary technology floor had doubled. And every evening, Ethan heard fragments of the same problem. Latency, synchronization, redundancy, failover. The engineers were studying each symptom separately. Ethan recognized the pattern. He said nothing. At 7:15, Claire stepped from an elevator and found him replacing a trash liner outside the conference room. She stopped. You really took the job. Ethan looked up. You sound surprised. I offered you exactly what you requested. And I accepted exactly what you offered. Claire glanced through the glass at the arguing engineers. Do you understand what they are discussing? Ethan tied the liner neatly. I understand they are working. That was not what I asked. A faint smile touched his face. You ask a lot of questions. It is how I built this company. Ethan pushed the cart forward. Sometimes answers cost more than questions. Claire watched him go. She had spent 3 weeks quietly searching his past and finding almost nothing before the gaps began. A few academic references. An old engineering conference listing. A technical paper that mentioned an E. Cole without a full name. Then silence. It was as if Ethan had deliberately stepped out of a world that once knew him. Later that night, Ethan reached the main systems corridor. The air smelled faintly of floor wax and overheated electronics. Through another glass wall, a dashboard pulsed with green status lights. One indicator flashed amber, disappeared, then returned. Ethan slowed. He watched the sequence repeat. Green, green, amber, normal. 30 seconds later, the same pattern returned on another node. He looked toward the engineers. Nobody reacted. They were focused on a different screen. Ethan studied the timing. Then the routing map reflected faintly in the glass. His expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. That is not latency, he murmured. A technician passing behind him barely heard. What did you say? Ethan looked at the amber light once more. Nothing. He resumed pushing his cart. The wheels squeaked softly down the corridor. Behind him, the indicator flashed again. This time Ethan did not turn around, but he knew what the engineers did not. The system was not failing yet. It was warning them. Claire held Ethan's gaze for several quiet seconds, and something about his question changed the room. Until then, everyone had been trying to understand why a man applying for custodial work could read a technical diagram like someone who had spent years inside systems engineering. Ethan, however, seemed more concerned with whether he would still have time to pick up his daughter. Claire closed the tablet. Fair enough, she said. Richard Hale leaned forward. Claire, we have investors arriving soon. Then I suggest you prepare for them. Richard understood the dismissal. He gathered his papers and left with the other executives, though not before giving Ethan one last puzzled look. When the door closed, Claire opened Ethan's resume again. There are almost 8 years here that tell me very little about you. Ethan glanced at the page. They tell you where I worked. They do not tell me where you learned what you just demonstrated. He looked toward the Chicago skyline. For a moment, the polished conference room disappeared from his thoughts. He remembered a smaller room, a kitchen barely wide enough, 2 chairs, and a little girl sitting at the table asking questions he never knew how to answer. My wife was named Rachel, he said quietly. Claire did not interrupt. She passed away when Sophie was 3. The words came without drama. No request for sympathy. No attempt to make grief sound noble. Just truth. Claire's voice softened. I am sorry. Ethan nodded. Thank you. He looked down at his hands. Before that, I had a different kind of life. Long hours. Travel. Deadlines. I kept telling myself I was doing it for my family. He paused. Then one day my daughter needed one parent who was actually there. Claire glanced at the unexplained years again. Suddenly, they did not look empty. So you walked away? I changed priorities. From your career? From anything that required Sophie to grow up waiting for me. Ethan remembered learning how to braid her hair from tutorial videos before kindergarten. He remembered packing peanut butter sandwiches at 6 in the morning, taking maintenance shifts after school hours, and sitting through parent conferences in work clothes that still smelled faintly of machine oil. He remembered turning down jobs with better salaries because they required travel. None of those choices appeared impressive on a resume. Every one of them mattered at home. Why janitorial work? Claire asked. Ethan answered immediately. Predictable schedule. Health insurance. 35-minute train ride if service is running normally. Sophie's after-school program closes at 6. Claire studied him. You calculated the commute before applying. I calculate anything that can make my daughter wonder whether I am coming. That answer stayed between them. Quiet. Heavy. Human. Claire had spent years surrounded by people who measured opportunity in stock options and titles. Ethan measured it in dinner times. She turned another page. And whatever you did before all this. Ethan's expression changed slightly. Not fear. Not shame. A closed door. That was another life. You do not want to talk about it. I came here asking for work, not recognition. Claire leaned back. Most people who enter this building want recognition. Maybe that is why. They notice titles before people. For the first time, Claire smiled. Ethan stood, adjusted his old navy tie, and picked up his folder. If the janitorial position is still available, I would like to be considered for it. Claire looked at him carefully. It is. Ethan nodded. Then that is enough. He walked toward the door with the same quiet dignity he had carried into the room. Claire watched him leave, then looked again at the technical diagram he had understood almost instantly. Ethan Cole had not abandoned his old life because he could not succeed in it. Somewhere along the way, he had simply decided that being present for one little girl mattered more than being important to everyone else. The warning became a crisis 4 days later, at 11:17 on a Thursday morning. Whitmore Systems had spent months preparing for the demonstration. Executives filled the 48th floor conference room. Investors watched from New York and San Francisco, and a wall-sized display showed the platform that could secure a $4.8 billion partnership. Claire stood at the head of the table, composed as always. Richard Hale sat beside her. Behind the glass, engineers monitored every node. For the first 6 minutes, everything worked perfectly. Then one green indicator turned amber. Another followed. A third disappeared entirely. What happened? Claire asked. Latency spike, an engineer answered. Application layer is falling behind. Compensate. Already trying. The display froze. Voices overlapped. Keyboards clicked faster. A phone began ringing and went unanswered. Richard stood. Restart the primary cluster. Ethan was 20 feet away in the corridor, replacing a liner in a wastebasket. He heard the order and stopped. Through the glass, he saw the same sequence he had noticed days earlier. Green, amber, failover, recovery. Then another node followed the pattern. His hand tightened around the edge of the janitorial cart. Restart it, Richard repeated. A technician reached for the command. Do not. The words were not loud, but they cut through the noise. Richard turned. What? Ethan stood in the doorway, still wearing his gray building services uniform. Do not restart that cluster. Richard stared at him. This is not the time. Ethan's eyes remained on the dashboard. If you restart it now, the redundancy layer will treat the recovery state as current. Then your backup will inherit the same fault. One engineer looked toward him. Another kept typing. Richard's patience vanished. Get back to work, Mr. Cole. Ethan nodded once. Yes, sir. He turned his cart toward the hallway. He had offered the warning. Dignity did not require forcing wisdom on people determined not to hear it. Wait. Claire's voice stopped him. Ethan turned. She stepped away from the conference table and looked through the glass at the failing dashboard. What did you see? Richard shook his head. Claire, we have an engineering team for this. And they have had 6 minutes. She looked at Ethan. What did you see? Ethan walked closer but did not touch the equipment. The failures are moving. Meaning, you are treating them like separate events. They are not. A senior engineer frowned. The nodes are geographically isolated. Physically, Ethan said. Not logically. The room quieted by degrees. Claire folded her arms. Keep going. Ethan pointed toward the display. Watch the recovery intervals. 30 seconds. Then another 30. The system is not randomly losing capacity. Something is handing the problem from one node to the next. The senior engineer stared at the timestamps. His expression changed. He is right about the intervals. Richard stepped closer. Even if he is, we still need the system back online. Then restarting is the worst thing you can do, Ethan said. Why? Claire asked. Ethan looked at the architecture map. Because the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. That answer silenced everyone. Claire's eyes narrowed. Then why is it failing? Ethan shook his head. I did not say it was failing. 3 engineers turned toward him at once. Ethan pointed to the amber indicators as another node entered recovery. It is protecting itself from something your monitoring tools are not showing you. Richard stared at him. And you know what that something is? Ethan watched the sequence. Repeat one final time. Not yet. Claire stepped aside, leaving an open path toward the engineering station. Then find out. 3 weeks later, Ethan Cole was exactly where he had asked to be. He was not sitting behind an executive desk or wearing a new title. At 6:45 on a Tuesday evening, he was pushing a blue janitorial cart along the 37th floor of Whitmore Systems while fluorescent lights hummed above him and the clean scent of floor wax drifted through the corridor. His gray uniform carried a simple badge that read Ethan Cole, Building Services. Most employees passed without looking twice. Ethan did not mind. He had spent years learning that being unnoticed and being unimportant were not the same thing. The job gave him steady hours, health insurance, and enough time to meet Sophie after school most days. That mattered more than anyone upstairs knowing his name. Good evening, Mr. Cole, a young engineer called while hurrying toward the elevators. Good evening. Still working? Ethan glanced at the overflowing recycling bin beside the conference room. Apparently, so are you. The engineer smiled and disappeared behind the elevator doors. Ethan returned to wiping fingerprints from the glass wall. Inside the conference room, 6 engineers stood around a digital display covered with performance charts. Their voices carried through the partially open door. The latency spike is coming from the application layer. Then why does it vanish during regional isolation? Monitoring delay. That does not explain the synchronization drift. Ethan's cloth stopped. 1 second. 2. Then he continued cleaning. He had heard variations of the same conversation for days. Latency. Synchronization. Failover. Redundancy. Each team treated the symptoms separately, but Ethan had begun noticing something they had not. The timing was too consistent. The failures were not behaving like failures. At 7:15, Claire stepped from the elevator and found him replacing a trash liner. You really stayed, she said. Ethan looked up. You hired me. I thought you might change your mind. The hours did not change. Claire glanced toward the engineers behind. The glass. Neither did your ability to notice things. Ethan tied the liner and placed it on his cart. That sounds like another question. Do you understand what they are discussing? I understand they are trying to solve a problem. And Ethan gave her a faint smile. And they did not ask me. Claire watched him push the cart away. Respect was beginning to replace curiosity, but the mystery remained. She had quietly searched his past and found fragments, an old engineering conference listing, a technical publication mentioning an E. Cole, then almost nothing. It was as if Ethan had stepped away from one life and carefully closed the door behind him. Later that evening, he reached the main system's corridor. Through the glass, rows of green indicators glowed across a monitoring dashboard. One light turned amber. Ethan slowed. It returned to green. 30 seconds later, another node flashed amber. Then a third. Same interval. Same recovery pattern. Ethan moved closer to the glass. The air carried the faint warmth of electronics beneath the sharper smell of cleaning solution. An engineer inside never looked up. Ethan studied the routing map reflected across the window. Green. Amber. Recovery. 30 seconds. His expression changed. That is not latency, he murmured. A technician passing nearby stopped. Did you say something? Ethan looked at the dashboard once more. Nothing important yet. He took hold of his cart and continued down the corridor. The small wheels squeaked against the polished floor until the sound disappeared around the corner. Behind him, another indicator turned amber. The engineers kept staring at the wrong screen. Ethan did not turn back, but now he understood one thing with uncomfortable certainty. The system was not breaking without warning. It had been warning them all along. Claire did not repeat herself. She simply stepped aside, and the space between Ethan and the engineering station opened like a door nobody in the room had expected him to walk through. Richard Hale stared at her. You cannot seriously be handing a $4.8 billion demonstration to a janitor. Claire kept her eyes on Ethan. I am asking him to explain what everyone else missed. Ethan did not move toward the keyboard. Instead, he studied the wall display. Green indicators flickered beside amber warnings. Numbers refreshed. Cooling fans whispered beneath the sharper sound of nervous typing. Then Ethan asked his first question. Who changed the synchronization policy? A young engineer looked up. Nobody changed it. Check. We already checked. Ethan remained calm. Check the policy, not the change log. The engineer hesitated, then opened another screen. His face tightened. There is an inherited rule from the legacy configuration. Ethan nodded once. When was it activated? That was his second question. Another engineer searched the deployment history. 9 days ago, during the redundancy update. Ethan looked toward the recovery intervals. Why was it allowed to propagate across all 3 regions? His third question brought silence. No one answered. Richard stepped forward. Because those regions are isolated. Ethan shook his head. That is the assumption. He pointed to the architecture map. They are isolated for traffic, not for recovery authority. The senior engineer who had challenged him earlier moved closer to the display. If the legacy rule is being inherited during failover, then every recovery event passes the same bad instruction forward. Ethan finished. 3 questions. 3 answers. 3 assumptions collapsing one after another. Claire watched the room change around him. 10 minutes earlier, people had looked at Ethan and seen a gray uniform. Now they were watching his hands, his eyes, the places on the screen where he chose to look. Can we stop it? Claire asked. Yes. How? Do not fight the failover. Break the inheritance chain. Ethan directed the engineers through a controlled isolation of the affected recovery rule. He never touched a keyboard without permission. He never raised his voice. He simply gave one instruction at a time and waited for the system to answer. Region 1 stable, an engineer said. 5 seconds passed. Region 2 stable. Everyone watched the final indicator. Amber, amber, then green. Region 3 stable. No one celebrated. Relief came. First is silence. The wall display refreshed, and the demonstration environment began responding normally again. Richard looked at Ethan as though the uniform had become impossible to understand. But across the room, an older engineer had gone completely still. Daniel Brooks had spent more than 30 years designing distributed systems. He had been invited that morning as a senior technical advisor, and until now he had barely spoken. He stepped toward the architecture map Ethan had corrected. Show me that recovery sequence again. Ethan looked at him. Daniel pointed to the 3 regions. The order you used. Show me. Ethan took a marker and drew 3 simple connections on the glass board. Daniel's face changed. Where did you learn that? Ethan set the marker down. A long time ago. Daniel stared at the lines. Then at Ethan. Then back at the lines. No. Richard frowned. What is it? Daniel ignored him. His voice became quieter. What did you say your name was? Ethan did not answer immediately. Claire did. Ethan Cole. Daniel slowly removed his glasses. For several seconds, The veteran engineer said nothing at all. Then he looked directly at the man in the gray building services uniform. Ethan Cole. His voice carried something Claire had not heard from anyone in that room all morning. Recognition. My God. The warning Ethan had noticed became a crisis 4 days later, at 11:17 on Thursday morning. Whitmore Systems had spent months preparing for this demonstration, and nearly everything Claire had built seemed to depend on the next hour. Investors joined from New York and San Francisco, while executives gathered around the long conference table on the 48th floor. Beyond the glass walls, Chicago moved beneath a bright autumn sky. Inside, nobody looked outside. A wall-sized display showed the platform behind a proposed $4.8 billion partnership. Richard Hale checked his watch. Claire stood at the head of the room. Begin. For 6 minutes, everything worked perfectly. Data moved across 3 regions. Green indicators held steady. Response times remained within target. Then one light turned amber. What was that? Claire asked. Temporary latency, an engineer replied. A second indicator turned amber. Then a third. The main display hesitated. Compensate, Richard said. Already doing it. Shift traffic west. Traffic is already moving. The screen froze for 2 seconds. Keyboards clicked faster. Phones began vibrating across the table. Richard stood. Restart the primary cluster. 20 feet away, Ethan was replacing a trash liner in the corridor. His hand stopped. Through the glass, he saw the pattern. Green. Amber. Recovery. 30 seconds. Another node followed. It was exactly what he had watched 4 nights earlier. A technician reached toward the restart command. Do not restart it. Ethan's voice was quiet, but the room heard him. Richard turned. Excuse me. Ethan remained beside his blue janitorial cart. Do not restart the cluster. Richard stared at the gray building services uniform as though it had spoken out of turn. Mr. Cole, this is an executive technology demonstration. Yes, sir. Then let the engineers handle it. Ethan looked toward the dashboard. If they restart now, the backup may inherit the same condition. Richard's jaw tightened. Get back to work. Ethan nodded once. Yes, sir. He turned his cart toward the hallway. He had offered what he knew. He would not beg anyone to respect it. Ethan. Claire's voice stopped him. He turned. She stepped away from the conference table. What did you see? Richard shook his head. Claire, we do not have time for this. Then stop wasting it. Silence. Claire looked at Ethan again. What did you see? Ethan walked closer to the glass, but did not touch a keyboard. The failures are moving. A senior engineer frowned. The regions are isolated. Physically, Ethan said. Not logically. He pointed toward the timestamps. Watch the recovery intervals. Everyone looked. 30 seconds, Claire said. Exactly. Then the next node enters recovery. The engineer leaned toward his monitor. He is right. Ethan continued. You are treating each event as a separate failure. They are connected. Richard folded his arms. Connected how? Ethan studied the architecture map. That is the part your monitoring is. Not showing. Another amber indicator appeared. The room became still. Can you prove it? Claire asked. Ethan looked at the display. Not from here. What do you need? Access to the recovery policy and the synchronization history. Richard gave a short laugh. You want engineering access? Ethan met his eyes calmly. No. I want someone with access to answer 3 questions. Claire glanced toward her technical team. Ask them. Ethan stepped closer. The faint smell of coffee mixed with warm electronics and floor cleaner. First question. Who changed the synchronization policy? The engineers looked at one another. Nobody answered. Ethan's voice remained quiet. Then that is where I would start. Daniel Brooks kept staring at Ethan as if 12 missing years had suddenly walked back into the room wearing a gray uniform. I know that sequence, he said quietly. Ethan's expression did not change. A lot of engineers know recovery sequencing. Daniel shook his head. Not like that. Claire looked between them. Daniel, what are you saying? The older engineer stepped toward the glass board and pointed to the 3 connections Ethan had drawn. This architecture began as part of the Cole Adaptive Recovery Model. I reviewed an early version more than a decade ago. Richard's face tightened. Cole. Daniel nodded slowly. Ethan Cole. The room fell silent. Claire looked at Ethan. You designed this? Ethan glanced at the restored green indicators. An early version. Other people improved it. Daniel gave a disbelieving laugh. Improved it? You solved a distributed recovery problem teams had been fighting for years. Ethan lowered his eyes. Praise seemed to make him more uncomfortable than doubt ever had. Claire remembered the fragments she had found, the old conference listing, the technical publication, the mysterious E. Cole. Suddenly the gaps had names. "Why did you disappear?" she asked. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Rachel got sick." No one interrupted. "I was traveling almost every week. Conferences, testing, development meetings. Then my wife needed me, and Sophie needed both of us." His voice softened. "When Rachel passed away, Sophie was 3. I had already missed enough evenings believing there would always be more." Daniel removed his glasses. "We tried to find you. I know. There were offers. I know. You could have led entire divisions." Ethan looked toward the windows. "My daughter could not be raised by an offer letter." The words settled over the room without accusation. Richard cleared his throat. "None of this changes the fact that Mr. Cole left the industry." Daniel turned toward him. "It changes whether we pretend he does not understand the system." Claire's gaze sharpened. "Richard, did you know who he was?" A pause. "Too long. I saw an old personnel reference after he was hired. And it was 12 years old. He applied for custodial work. I assumed whatever experience he had was no longer relevant." Claire looked at Ethan's uniform, then back at Richard. "You assumed." Richard said nothing. Ethan did not smile. He did not demand an apology. He simply looked at the dashboard. "Is the synchronization layer stable?" A young engineer checked. "All 3 regions are holding." "Recovery policy?" "Corrected." "Backup integrity?" Another engineer answered. "Clean." Ethan nodded, then finished the demonstration. Claire stared at him. "That is all you have to say?" Ethan met her eyes. "The system needed fixing. It is fixed." There was no victory speech. No satisfaction in watching anyone feel small. That was the part Claire understood most clearly. Ethan had been underestimated, dismissed, and spoken around as though his uniform defined the limits of his mind. Yet when the truth finally gave him power over the room, he used none of it to humiliate anyone. Daniel extended his hand. Ethan took it. "It is good to see you again," Daniel said. "You too." Around them, engineers slowly returned to their stations. The investor screens came back online. Green indicators held steady across the wall. But something else had changed, something no dashboard could measure. 20 minutes earlier, people had stepped around Ethan Cole without seeing him. Now nobody in the room could look at him without seeing the man they had failed to notice. For several seconds after Ethan asked his first question, nobody moved. Then Claire turned toward the engineering team. "Answer him." A young systems engineer swallowed and opened the configuration panel. No one changed the synchronization policy. Ethan remained beside the janitorial cart. "Check the active policy, not the change log." The engineer hesitated, then searched deeper. The conference room filled with the soft tapping of keys and the steady hum of cooling fans. "There is an inherited rule," he said at last. "Legacy configuration." Ethan nodded. "When did it become active?" That was his second question. Another engineer pulled up the deployment history. 9 days ago, during the redundancy update. Ethan looked at the architecture map. Why was it allowed to propagate across all 3 regions? His third question brought a longer silence. Richard Hale folded his arms. "Because the regions are isolated." Ethan shook his head. "For customer traffic, yes. Not for recovery authority." The senior engineer nearest the display leaned closer. "If the legacy rule is inherited during failover, then every recovered node could pass the same instruction to the next region." "Exactly," Ethan said. 3 questions. 3 answers. 3 assumptions that had looked solid until someone finally asked what they were built on. Claire watched the room change. Minutes earlier, several people had barely looked at Ethan because of the uniform on his back. Now nobody looked anywhere else. "Can you stop it?" she asked. "Your engineers can." Ethan pointed toward the configuration panel. "Isolate the inherited recovery rule first. Do not restart the cluster. Then restore authority 1 region at a time." The senior engineer looked at Claire. She nodded. "Do it." Region 1 stabilized. 5 seconds passed. Region 2 returned to green. The final amber indicator flickered once, twice, then disappeared. "Region 3 stable," someone said. Nobody cheered. Relief arrived as silence. The wall display refreshed, and the demonstration environment began responding normally. Richard stared at Ethan. "How did you know where to look?" Ethan glanced at the system map. "Because the failure was too orderly to be random." Before Richard could respond, a Quiet voice came from the far side of the room. Draw that sequence. Daniel Brooks, the company's 62-year-old senior technical advisor, had been watching without speaking. Ethan looked at him. The recovery sequence? Yes. Daniel handed him a marker. Ethan stepped to the glass board and drew 3 simple connections, showing how recovery authority moved from one region to another. Daniel's expression changed. Again, Ethan added the fallback path. Daniel moved closer. Where did you learn that architecture? Ethan capped the marker. A long time ago. Daniel stared at the lines as if they had opened a door into his own past. No. Claire turned toward him. Daniel. He did not answer her. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan. What is your full name? Ethan paused. Claire answered instead. Ethan Cole. Daniel slowly removed his glasses. The color seemed to leave his face, not from fear, but from recognition too powerful to hide. He looked at Ethan's gray building services uniform, then at the recovery model on the glass. Ethan Cole, he repeated softly. Richard frowned. You know him? Daniel did not look away. For several seconds, only the cooling fans could be heard. Then the veteran engineer whispered, My God, I know exactly who he is. 3 days later, Ethan sat across from Claire in the same 48th floor conference room where people had once wondered why he had been allowed through the door. Morning sunlight rested across the polished table. Between them lay a new employment offer. Claire slid it toward him. Chief Systems Advisor. Flexible authority across engineering and infrastructure. Salary, equity, full benefits. Ethan read the first page, then the second. Claire waited for the reaction she had seen from countless executives when numbers became large enough to change their lives. Ethan simply asked, What time would I get home? Claire blinked. Excuse me. Most days. What time would I leave? She looked at the offer again. That would depend on the schedule. Ethan closed the folder. Sophie eats dinner at 6. Claire leaned back. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she understood. Ethan had already walked away from one impressive life because it demanded more of him than he was willing to take from his daughter. Money had never been the mystery. Priority was. What schedule do you need? She asked. Ethan looked surprised. For days here. 1 day remote when possible. I leave by 5 unless something truly cannot wait. Claire nodded. Done. You should think about it. I just did. A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face. Then I accept. 6 months later, the gray building services uniform no longer hung in Ethan's apartment closet, but his old employee badge remained in the top drawer of his desk. His new office was modest by executive standards because he had refused the larger one. On the shelf beside technical books sat Sophie's purple crayon drawing beneath a small frame. Good luck, Dad. Claire noticed it every time she visited. She also noticed other changes. Ethan left meetings when he promised Sophie he would. He attended school programs without apologizing for being unavailable. He taught younger engineers without reminding them what they had once assumed about him. Even Richard had learned to say Ethan's name with respect, though Ethan never demanded an apology. One Friday evening, Claire joined Ethan and Sophie at a neighborhood diner near their apartment. Nothing expensive. Red vinyl booths. Coffee cups clinking behind the counter. Sophie carefully divided a stack of pancakes into 3 uneven pieces. Dad says you work too much, she told Claire. Ethan nearly dropped his coffee. Sophie. Claire laughed. Your dad may be right. He usually is, but do not tell him I said that. Ethan smiled, and something quiet passed between them. Not a promise. Not yet. Just warmth, respect, and the possibility that second chances sometimes arrived without announcing themselves. Weeks later, Claire stood in Ethan's office while he searched for a document. She noticed the old janitorial badge inside the open drawer. You kept it. Ethan looked down. Yes. Why? He picked it up and turned it between his fingers. It reminds me how quickly people decide what someone is worth. Claire looked at the simple words building services beneath his name. And what should they see instead? Ethan's eyes moved towards Sophie's drawing. The person. Outside his office. Employees crossed the hallway beneath the same fluorescent lights that had once illuminated a man pushing a janitorial cart, while almost everyone walked past him. Ethan placed the badge back in the drawer and closed it gently. He had gained a title, a better salary, and the respect of an entire company, but none of those things had created his worth. They had only revealed what had been there all along. Because dignity does not become greater when the world finally notices it. Sometimes the world simply becomes quiet enough to see it. Daniel Brooks kept his eyes on Ethan as if 12 missing years had just stepped back into the room, wearing a gray building services uniform. "I know that recovery sequence," he said quietly. Ethan lowered his gaze toward the glass board. "A lot of engineers know recovery sequencing." Daniel shook his head. "Not that one." Claire looked between them. "Daniel, what are you saying?" The older engineer walked to the board and touched one of the connections Ethan had drawn. "This logic came from an early distributed recovery model I reviewed more than a decade ago. Most of us thought it was too ambitious to scale." He turned toward Ethan. "He did not learn this architecture from someone else." Richard frowned. "Then where did he learn it?" Daniel answered without looking away. "He helped create it." Silence settled across the room. Claire remembered the old technical paper she had found, the conference listing, the initials E, Cole buried in records that suddenly made sense. "Ethan?" she asked. He looked at the restored dashboard rather than at her. It was an early model. A lot of people worked on what came after. Daniel gave a soft, disbelieving laugh. "You always did that." "Did what?" "Made something extraordinary and talked about it like you had repaired a loose hinge." Ethan almost smiled. Claire stepped closer. "Why did you leave?" His expression softened. "Rachel became ill." The room grew quieter. "At first, I thought I could manage both. Work during the day, travel when necessary, be home when I could." He paused. "But when your family starts, measuring time differently, deadlines stop looking as important." Daniel removed his glasses. "We tried to contact you. I know. There were companies offering you entire teams. I know that too." Ethan looked toward the windows. "Sophie was 3 when her mother passed away. She did not need me leading a team. She needed me making breakfast." No one answered. Claire looked at his gray uniform, then at the architecture diagram that had just helped protect a partnership worth billions. The contrast no longer felt ironic. It felt revealing. Richard cleared his throat. Whatever Mr. Cole did 12 years ago, he still chose to leave the industry. Daniel turned toward him. "And somehow you think choosing his daughter made him less capable?" Richard's expression tightened. Claire's voice became calm. "Did you know about his history?" A pause. "I found an old personnel reference after he was hired." "And you said nothing?" "He applied for custodial work. I assumed his technical experience was outdated." Claire held his gaze. "You assumed." Richard said nothing. Ethan could have enjoyed the moment. He could have listed every credential, every mistake others had made, every reason they should feel embarrassed. Instead, he turned toward the young engineer at the console. "Are all 3 regions stable?" The engineer checked. "Yes." "Recovery policy?" "Corrected." "Backup integrity?" Another engineer answered. "Clean." Ethan nodded. "Then finish the demonstration." Claire stared at him. "That is all." Ethan looked genuinely puzzled. "The system needed fixing." Daniel smiled faintly. "Still Ethan Cole." One by one, the engineers returned to their stations. The investor screens came back online. Green indicators held steady across the wall. But nobody in that room saw Ethan the way they had an hour earlier. He had been dismissed, underestimated, and measured by the name printed beneath his employee badge. Yet when the truth finally gave him every opportunity to make others feel small, he chose grace instead. Daniel extended his hand. Ethan took it. "Good to see you again," Daniel said. "You too." Around them, the room returned to work, but the silence had already said what no speech could. The man they had barely noticed had never needed a better title to become worthy of their respect. They had simply needed to become wise enough to see him. 3 days later, Ethan sat across from Claire in the same 48th floor conference room, where his gray uniform had once seemed more important to everyone than the man wearing it. Morning sunlight stretched across the polished table, and between them rested a thin employment folder. Claire pushed it toward him. Chief Systems Advisor. Flexible authority across engineering and infrastructure. Full benefits, equity, and a salary appropriate for the responsibility. Ethan opened the folder. He read the first page carefully, then the second. Claire had negotiated contracts with executives who reacted to numbers before they finished reading them. Ethan barely reacted at all. He looked up. "What time would I get home?" Claire paused. "What? On a normal day? What time would I leave?" She glanced at the offer. "We can structure the schedule." Ethan closed the folder gently. "Sophie eats dinner at 6. The room became quiet. Claire finally understood that Ethan was not negotiating money. He was protecting something money had already failed to replace once. What schedule do you need? She asked. For days here. One remote when the work allows it. I leave by 5 unless there is a genuine emergency. Done. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You should probably think about that. Claire smiled. I just did. He extended his hand. Then I accept. 6 months later, Ethan no longer pushed a janitorial cart through Whitmore systems. But he had not become the kind of executive who forgot the people who did. He knew the names of the night cleaners. He thanked the maintenance staff. He taught younger engineers to question assumptions before blaming people. His office was smaller than the one Claire originally offered because he had chosen it himself. On one shelf sat technical books. Beside them was Sophie's purple crayon drawing beneath a simple frame. Good luck, Dad. Claire noticed it every time she visited. She also noticed Ethan leaving at 5 when he promised Sophie he would. He attended school. Events without apologizing for being unavailable. He never treated presents as something a father should earn after finishing everything else. Even Richard had changed. His respect came slowly, but it came honestly. Ethan never demanded an apology. Grace had done what humiliation never could. One Friday evening, Claire joined Ethan and Sophie at a neighborhood diner near their apartment. Coffee cups clinked behind the counter. The smell of pancakes and maple syrup filled the room. Sophie divided a stack of pancakes into 3 uneven pieces. Dad says you work too much, she told Claire. Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. Sophie. Claire laughed. Your dad might be right. He usually is, Sophie whispered, but do not tell him. Ethan smiled. Something warm passed between him and Claire. Nothing rushed. Nothing promised. Just respect becoming friendship, and friendship quietly leaving room for a second chance. Weeks later, Claire noticed Ethan's old building services badge inside an open desk drawer. You kept it. Ethan picked it up. Yes. Why? He turned the badge between his fingers. It reminds me how quickly people decide what someone is worth. Claire looked at the words beneath his name. And what should they see instead? Ethan glanced towards Sophie's drawing. The person. Outside his office, employees moved beneath the same fluorescent lights that had once shone over a man almost nobody noticed. Ethan placed the badge back in the drawer and closed it gently. The new title had not given him dignity. The salary had not created his worth. Recognition had not made him extraordinary. Those things had only revealed what had been there all along. Because dignity does not need to shout for the world to recognize it. Sometimes the world simply has to become quiet enough to see.